I'm Radhika Saveri, Professor of Practice at SMU for PODWalk, a podcast that encourages the audience to get off their screens, go for a walk, listen and learn through conversation about marketing strategies. Today we have with us Terry Stone, who's Managing Partner of the Americas at Oliver Wyman. Welcome, Terry. And we're going to talk about accelerating breakthroughs in culture and in business.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Well, we are very excited to have you, and especially today because today is International Women's Day. And so I wanted to start with talking about the topic of female leaders, a topic that is very close to your heart and mine. How have you, in your role, Terry, supported breaking the bias and embracing equity for women at Oliver Wyman?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'd say there's probably three things that have really made a difference in some of what I've been doing there. It goes a little beyond Oliver Wyman. But the first, I think, is trying to lead by example. And I think that is actually not something that earlier in my career I totally felt as comfortable doing. So I've been in this business for 25 years. So you can imagine I was starting in the workforce in the earlier 90s. And even as late and recently as the early 2000s. So we have sons that are the same age. So I worked part-time. I was on the partner track at our firm, and I was working part-time when my son was born. I decided I wanted to do 4 days a week so I could have a little bit of a sense of what it's like to be a mom and be home, not just on the weekends. And in the beginning, I worked really hard to try and make it seem as if I could be in this client service industry as flexible and as available as I needed to be. I'd work 4 days a week, but I would make it the problem of the client or the team. I'd figure it all out. And so I was often bending over backwards trying to make it work. It actually was making it harder for the team and it definitely harder for me. But what I realized was that it was as if I was keeping it from others that that's what I was doing. And as I got more confident, once I was a partner and I was up higher in my career, I made a conscious choice all the time to be telling people what I was doing if I was taking time for my family, or I was taking time because I needed to do something, or I was going away. I was, by putting it out there, it made it more accessible for other people.
Absolutely.
And it actually changed things, quite frankly, as I got in more senior leadership roles, not only for the women, but it changed the tone of the conversation we'd have, and even the male partners in our practice. Like we started to notice that it just was a different set of things people would talk about. Like they had to get home to their kids, or they had something important over the weekend, a sporting event or something they had to do.
Sort of open the dialogue.
It opened the dialogue, exactly. So that was one. A second one was at one point, our CEO said, would you take on the executive sponsorship role of the Global Executive Committee for Inclusion and Diversity? We had a director of IDB, and he said, would you take it on? Someone on the EXCO has to be the champion. And I looked at him, I said, okay, I'll do it, but I'm only doing it if we're going to change some things around here. And he said, yeah, well, I'm happy to, whatever you think. And I said, okay, we're going to stop talking about it and we're going to start doing things. Like we have all the best of intentions, but the numbers aren't moving fast enough. And I basically said, I know there's lots of debates out there about whether one should set targets or goals, or if they become sort of a problem and it creates bias, but we're going to set some goals because this is a business. And when you set goals, people achieve them. And within 6 months of setting targets over a 5-year trajectory we did it for women, we did it for various races. And in doing so, within 6 months, you could see the difference. Nobody came with their presentations to the EXCO without talking about how are we doing on gender. And it was 5 years ago that we last got together as a global, I was telling you I was in London, since we last got together as a global leadership team. And just last week while I was there, we had the annual women's lunch or the women's partner breakfast. And 5 years ago, it could fit in a large private room. And so going to this lunch just last week, I thought to myself, no longer am I the person being asked all the time to chair it. I was attending, and I thought, I guess we're going to use that big private room. And I walked in and we took over the entirety of the restaurant. It was just amazing. Such a great thing to see.
Yeah.
That it had
exploded
completely in a way that you just sort of had not really experienced before. And even better, later in the afternoon, when I was talking to some of the other partners, when I was in breakout, a number of the men commented and said, how was the women's lunch? I was like, it was fantastic. Many of them think it was the best event so far. And they said, it was really noticeable when we were at lunch and none of you were there. So the idea that they also noticed.
Yeah.
So that was the second one, just the ability to push forward to get more impact.
And awareness does that. as the awareness spreads, people recognize it even more. It's not that they didn't know about it before, but it just brings it top of mind.
It's more present.
And it's more present. It's in the moment.
100%, which brings me to the last one, which was we wrote this sort of seminal thing called Making the Invisible Visible, sort of, and it was a Women in Leadership report. And what we set out to do when we began the research was to explain why, despite so many well-intended senior executives out there in the Fortune 1000, so everybody's talking about we need more women senior up in the workplace, why did it feel like it was moving so slowly? Right? I said I've been doing this job for 25 years. It's not like this is a new topic. And we said, well, what is it? And our theory was usually when something's not working, something's hidden. There's something we don't see that's getting in the way, hence the title, Making the Invisible Visible. And when we got into it, what we started to realize was simply that it's where unconscious bias crept in, and the idea that despite the best of intentions, people just do not have an adequate appreciation for what they can't see. And so these are things like when men speak over women or misattribution in a meeting. I'm sure you've been in one where you say something
just once or twice.
Yeah, and no one reacts. And then 15 minutes later, literally a guy across the table says a derivative of almost the same thing. And everyone goes, oh, I totally agree with Bobby. Right? And so women experience this all the time. And we started to dig into understanding why it might be that the way women communicate versus the way men hear it, they may not even be realizing that that's not what they heard. Right. And we started to realize there's all these blind spots that people have that they don't understand, which actually get in the way of helping women move up and move forward. Because the women aren't even aware of what's going on, and the men are not aware. And so
the conversations happen. Because the more conversations you have, all of these biases that you're talking about that lie so deep,
100%. 100%. We had recently someone asked me, I was doing something for Catalyst. The organization Catalyst's mission is really pushing the advancement of women. And we were talking about allyship for men. Yes. And we discussed, I said, one of the best programs we put in place was actually a grassroots effort by a number of men who said, well, we want to be part of the solution. We want to help more. And they created this group called Men for Change. And Men for Change started with a bunch of like-minded guys going, how do we help advance it and push it? And what it really ultimately became, it became much broader and many more people participated than just sort of the cutting edge. But it became the safe space to talk about how they feel about sometimes that they don't get it. And they feel like they're about to walk on a landmine or they're stepping on eggshells. They can't ask a question without feeling like we're saying something, without the risk or fear of saying the wrong thing or feeling stupid.
Yeah.
And so as a result, we were getting stuck. Mm-hmm. And I mean me, not we, our company, but just society. And so I think these ideas that you help make the invisible visible so we can just put it out there and talk about it, I think helps a lot.
Yeah. And I think when you talk about stuff, that issue goes away.
Yeah, they completely appreciate it. They're like, oh, that's
good intention.
That's what was going on. And I'm like, yeah, that's what was going on. You didn't see that. So I do think that helps.
And I think it's great that you're talking about allyships, because no matter what we are trying to solve for, whether it is gender inequality or it's
race, socioeconomic, anything.
Yeah, anything really. Allyship is so important, because otherwise you're just talking to the same people. It's like an echo chamber. You're talking to yourself.
Yes.
And we already, as women, know of many of the biases. So unless we bring the entire society into it and have that conversation, you're talking to yourself, in a sense.
Yes, bring them together, have the conversation, and be curious and lean.
Absolutely. And be a part of the solution, because then you embrace that solution.
Totally agree.
I really enjoyed hearing what you had to say about making the invisible visible. And just like that, we also talk about making the impossible possible. Mm-hmm. And today, especially, decisions are moving at a very, very rapid pace, and at a pace that we would have previously considered impossible. And as things have shifted, as trends have shifted, I think companies are racing ahead to redesign strategies, to redesign their operations, so that they can make decisions in weeks rather than in years. Yes. So if we had to think about these business trends and shifts, what would you say we should focus on for 2023?
2023, yeah. I think there's a couple that are big. One of the first is the changing nature of the expectations of the workforce. Overall, like post-COVID, we still have this. No one has really figured out hybrid perfectly, right? We're sitting on a ton of commercial real estate that, quite frankly, is like a ghost town when you walk into it. I mean, I was at a client yesterday, and it looks like they had about 15 people, inside in their building, and they said literally like 87% of their people are permanent remote work. It's just like, what are we doing with all of this? But this idea that the workforce itself is looking for different things, I think, is a big, important one that also dovetails into, in particular, the emerging end of the workforce. So one of the big things we also did some research on was in Gen Z. And Gen Z, in this case, let's define it between people between about 18 and 25. And what they expect of their employers, what they expect of the companies that they buy from, it's fundamentally different. And I'll be really honest, I think so fundamentally different that despite looking at statistics or talking to people, I think people our age who are in leadership roles really struggle with internal. They can't comprehend it. And literally, the number of people who say, well, just wait till this next recession, that'll sort everybody out. And I'm like, it's not going to sort everybody out. Like, this group, 50% of these people.
But not so much that that is different than what we have gone through. I mean, in the short years, you said 18 to 25. In those short years, about 30 years,
been a lot.
They've gone through the recession. They've gone through COVID. I mean, imagine going through COVID. They've gone through a lot.
They absolutely have, and they were raised sort of differently. Technology was at a fundamentally different stage when they came on the scene, but the things that they value. I mean, it's just, so if you're an employer looking to employ people, like these people will represent almost 30% of the workforce by 2025. So that's in fairly short order. These are the people we're all trying to attract and recruit. Yet 2/3 of them, basically when they're looking at it, they don't believe, they believe that their employer has to stand for the things that are important to them, but they also don't believe that their job defines who they are in the same way. Or I guess I would best describe it. One of our research findings that I found interesting was many in our generation, or generation of people in leadership, thought you get a job, you work hard. You work hard to do better than perhaps your parents did, which this generation finds is going to be very hard to do. You work hard to put that money away and do those things so that when you retire, and ideally you retire earlier than that other generation, that you can enjoy this life. And they don't view it that way. 2/3 of them view it as, I'm supposed to be able to enjoy it now. And so that comes into their attitude into the job and how many hours they're willing to work and what they're willing to sacrifice in their personal life now. They don't want to leverage it for the future.
And part of it, we have created that as parents, of kids who are about 20 years of age. So we have talked about being a moment, So that is what they have come to believe, which is what they believe, and that's where the fundamentally our generation finds difficult to wrap their heads around. Because we want that. We were the workforces.
Right. It was like lean in and work and then you get your thing later, right? Yeah. And instead, people really are struggling with, well, that's not what I want. So how do you attract this workforce? And it's been particularly problematic challenging the last few years because the labor markets have been super hot. It's hard to kind of do it. And I think companies are struggling to find that optimal value proposition. But this generation also, 1 in 5 would literally, you and I were talking earlier about, I don't have that much time to keep it. I don't investigate every company I buy from. If it's a product I like and it's a good company and I've been using it forever,
I just keep buying it.
I just keep buying it, right? But 1 in 5 will switch immediately if they believe anything about the company and what they're doing. I mean, there was the whole debacle with Pepsi and Kendall Jenner and what happened there and like things like that where people just go, no way, like you are not the company or the product for me. And I think that's quite different than what other generations were. And I think companies are still trying to adapt and figure out how to meet their needs.
Where they are.
Exactly.
Absolutely. And I read the report that you all did on Gen Zs, and you'll talk about them as being the more generation. Mm-hmm. They want more of being, they want to be more sustainable. They want to be more on social causes. They want to be more on experiences. They want to be more on enjoying life today. So that they are certainly that generation that wants things differently. differently. And so I think brands are going to have to shift to accommodate.
They want things differently. They'll drop. They want to buy from companies that align with their values. And I think that was just starting in our generation. I think so. People, it's just this disconnect between who's in leadership and who's making the calls on the next thing on the product or the brand. Yeah. So we'll see how that kind of evolves. So I think that one is really important. I think there are aspects about the supply chain complexity that are never going to go back to the way it was. I mean, I'm working on we're making renovations to a house right now, and I sit there. I mean, we're 3 years post COVID, and I still I'm looking for a kitchen faucet, and my builder's like, "Well, you've got to get me what I can get," and I'm going, "How is it possible that we're still 18 weeks out on something as simple as a kitchen faucet, right?" But what we found in COVID was the supply chains were so disrupted that it's causing companies to fundamentally rethink where they source things from. So nearshoring or onshoring and having more resilient supply chains, it's a huge challenge to be able to meet demand because nobody ever wants to get caught flat-footed like that again. And with the incredible consumer demand and the incredible amount of the reliance on China as a market, I think people are starting to think about just bifurcating. And what is the supply chain I need for China? And then what are my other alternatives that give me flexibility? So I think that's another big one that companies are really, really wrestling with. For a long time, the supply chain was meant to get me the lowest cost. Now I think people are going, I need on demand, I need resiliency, I need the risk of lowest cost, but I could stock out completely. I think companies are realizing this.
It's a different way of thinking about this.
Exactly. And then the last one, I think, this one's interesting. The climate and sustainability challenge. I still think this will be, this is a big deal. It will be a growing big deal. 50% of companies that are basically registered with the SEC do, in fact, publish their SEG statistics, their ESG statistics, excuse me. But really, it's right now, Europe is totally leading the charge. Everybody there is signed up for their disclosures. The level of rigor required is so much higher. You don't hear about it as much in the US market because I think it's spring of 23 where we're going to be getting a bit more clarity around what are the SEC disclosures that are going to be required for level not only 1 and 2, but level 3 carbon emissions. And I think everyone's waiting and we'll see sort of where politics winds up and what goes on, but it'll be interesting to see what happens. But because there are so many multinational companies, the pressure coming out of Europe and other places is going to put a lot of pressure on companies in the US to actually adapt. And then we'll see what continues to kind of trickle down and happen. But between the pressures of the consumers finding it valuable and what the disclosures will be, I think that will be a really big shift in trend in what companies have to pay more attention to. Right. For the last 5 years, people are like, oh, right. Yeah, our sustainability reports. Right. They've got a directory level person responsible for it. But I think it's going to become something much more, every board I know out there is much more focused on what are we doing.
Absolutely. And I think companies in general, what I'm hearing you say is they're revisiting the assumptions of how business was conducted and should be conducted.
Yes,
fundamentally. And I think everything that you have described right now, it makes me think about the fact that sometimes nothing happens for decades and then weeks. Decades happen in weeks. And I think we've sort of experienced that in our months of COVID, but also post the pandemic. Mm-hmm. So we're experiencing a lot of that. As you think about all of these accelerating breakthroughs, given your background in healthcare, what are the shifts or changes that you are seeing there?
Yeah, it's interesting. Healthcare is a really interesting sector. It's sort of where I came up through the ranks, and it's something that I still do a lot of work in, and it's really intriguing because I don't think the average person realizes that in the Fortune 500, 4 out of the top 10 are very large healthcare companies like United Healthcare and CVS, McKesson, AmerisourceBergen, very large, right? 15 years ago, that was occupied by the ExxonMobils, the other, but Walmart, but 4 out of the top 10. And then 4 more out of the top 10. So that makes up 8 out of the 10 are things like Google's Alphabet or Amazon or Apple or Walmart, all companies that are making big, bold, disruptive plays in the healthcare space. So healthcare is really big business, especially here in the US, right? So there's a lot going on there. A lot of people are pumping money into it. I think there's a lot, you're familiar with how inefficient, how ineffective. It's not the most customer service oriented part of the economy, right? And so the idea that disruptor innovators, like the last four names I mentioned, will come in and be the agent of change that says, no, we don't do it that way anymore. The way United Healthcare did, or the way your local hospital did, we do it this way. It's much more consumer convenience. I think is going to be a really big disruptor. Interestingly, we found during COVID, you wouldn't be surprised that telehealth like went through the roof because nobody was going to the doctor, right? Prior to that, in 2019 or in January of 2020, this is a point where if I had touched down in China, I would have opened up my phone, called up an Uber, or I would have gone on and I would have gone on maps and found my way to the restaurant I had to go to. Yet the incidence rates of like telehealth at that time, they were in the single digits. I mean, nobody was using it. It made absolutely no sense. And it just skyrocketed through COVID. And it's coming back down. It's like maintained, but I wouldn't say it's fundamentally upended the way healthcare is done. More and more is being done virtually, but I think there will be more technology and more innovation. I think will keep driving the healthcare space forward. But one of the interesting things is we've had the most recent trends. There was a lot of money going into private equity, going into healthcare innovation, digital health companies, drug related. There was a lot therapeutics. There was a lot of money going in, and for about the last 6 to 9 months, the deal volume's gone down by like a third. Valuations are getting kind of crunched. So I think things have been a little stagnant. And I think what we're starting to see is that's clearing out. And what you should expect by the latter half of 2023 and going on is I think we're getting to a point where prices and demand between different companies trying to trade, venture-backed funds, it's getting more leveled out and we'll see more activity and innovation there. I think we kind of went through a spike up, then it kind of settled and got stuck in the mud and we're going to see more there.
Right. And it's almost expected to go that way when you have that sort of spike during a pandemic situation. It's sort of, that's unexpected.
It's totally expected to go through spikes like that. And that's what we saw. And then I think what we're going to find is the disruption you will find in healthcare will come from these outside entities.
Yeah. And I think what you said about efficiency and effectiveness, there's also accessibility. Because with telehealth, as I think about that, it's also allowing people that don't have the access, don't have the time, they're especially lower socioeconomic groups perhaps that don't have the time or the ability of it's made
right. If you're a third shift worker, it's not as easy.
It's not as easy. Right. So it's made it a lot more accessible and convenient. So we are hoping to see more and more of that. But of course, sometimes the economics of profit is not always compatible with the economics of all this flexibility that you're talking about. So Terry, I've known you for many years, and with you, what you see is what you get. And I was across the pond in Europe on vacation, and I ran into someone from Oliver Wyman who happened to know you, and he described you exactly the same way. That's a very consistent brand. And brand values to me, they're simple, but they're really hard. How have you done it?
Yeah, so how it's nice to hear, I guess, that I come across the same, regardless of the various settings that I'm in or people it carries forward. But I would say, as an individual, authenticity is the most important part of having a consistent brand. Now, I would argue if your consistent brand relates a little bit to what you see is what you get, it's a little easier to be authentic because you're sort of not trying to be different things at any time. But I think that idea of authenticity, like, who are you? What matters to you? Because when you're aligned internally with what matters to you, what you value, and who you are, it's easy to show up the same all the time. I think what makes it hard is when you're trying to be something else.
Right. So when it's intrinsic in you.
It's no longer
intrinsic.
These are intrinsic to you. When you're not doing that because you value these things, but you feel like in order to be accepted or in order for this to work, you have to show up a little bit differently. So you're 15 degrees off that way, or you have to show up a little bit differently in another setting. I think it makes it a lot harder. Yeah. Because it's like a mask where you're putting it on all the time and it's hard to be consistent. It's almost like you're acting and you're in costume in a role versus when it's the same.
And when you really believe in it, it exudes in behavior, no matter what environment, what context you're in. And every time I've seen you as a mother, I've seen you at work with your work colleagues, I've seen you in personal settings, it's been the same. And I think that truly comes from that right belief, and having a link between the intention and how you're showing up. So, and I think that's important because it sort of bridges that gap. How would you translate that into challenges that you think a institution, a brand would face? Because you were saying earlier, it's easier when you're a personal brand
Right.
because you're one person and
You're one person, it's still not easy for everyone, but if you're doing something that's intrinsic to who you are, it's probably a little bit easier to show up that way all the time. And then it is harder when you get to a company-wide setting. Building on one of your comments there, though, about another thing that triggered a thought for me on why it's so important to be authentic. When people are being authentic, they're actually creating energy and giving energy out. It's tiring and exhausting to be playing different roles that are not intrinsic to who you are. And so in some ways the energy builds and it's easier to sustain something when you are being authentic, right? Because you get energized by it, which creates momentum. People experience your brand differently,
and
right?
momentum builds momentum.
And momentum builds momentum. So I think it's much easier. So for a company to be authentic. So say that you've got your personal brand and your values, but you want to translate that to what are your corporate values? And how do we ensure that we embody that every day in our experiences for our employees and our experiences for our customers? Like, how do you make that happen? That's a much bigger challenge, right? I'm one person that needs to be consistent with me. You have tens of thousands of employees who have millions and millions of touch points and interactions with each other, with your customers, right? That's a lot of complexity to manage. You can't micromanage and control it all. So I think the companies who do it well are very intentional about being very explicit and clear about what are our values. And not just statements, like there's plenty of companies who have our values, and they're on the placard behind reception.
Yeah, we all have that.
We all have that, or their posters here and there, right? But if you stopped an employee in the hallway, could they recite the values? And if they can't, they're probably not day to day living the values every day because they're these abstractions of words. So I think people understanding them and making it clear is really important. At Oliver Wyman, we just recently redid our corporate values. I say redid them because I'd say the central thesis through them is 85% consistent with what it's been for decades. But interestingly, what we all realized as leaders was they were these very long statements that were very hard to retain. Our corporate values, and we have 5 of them, but they are literally comprised of 14 words across 5. So it's easy to say, like one of ours is be brave. Another is work as one. Another is lead with heart. Like these are just not that hard to remember. So the first thing is make them simple, make them memorable. The second thing, when you're trying to do this with thousands of people and millions of experiences, is how do you even translate that into a story in my head about what that means? What does it mean to live that value? What does it mean to be brave? Right?
Really explaining what that means, because interpretations can be different. You have people from so many different experiences in your organization. So everyone's interpretation of be brave or
right.
with your heart is very different, or could be very different. So what you're saying is just making it very clear as to what it is.
100%. And they can sometimes, or things can be at odds with each other. So take be brave. Be brave without enough effort amongst the people talking about repeatedly, we've been doing this for months. What does it mean? You're being brave when you're doing what? If you're not careful, be brave means speak up, be bold.
At any cost.
Tell the truth. Yeah, at any cost, right? Taken to its extreme, that can sound like basically open season on be rude.
Right.
Don't worry. So to us, we've got be brave, and it's juxtaposed with lead with heart and work as one. It's hard to work as one if people are being self-serving. So you have to help people understand the complex interplay of these, right? Being brave is not only about speaking up. It's not only sharing your opinion and telling people what you think. It's being brave enough to pause and ask questions and be curious about others, to be willing to hear a perspective that's different than yours and incorporate it into your thoughts.
And that's hard.
But that's not the same as just being drive. When you're doing that, you're also better able to work as one.
Collaboration, openness,
right? But I need you to be brave enough to seek out and hear conflicting perspectives and come up with something else. And when you do that, you'll be able to better work as one.
And it's a very active.
Yes.
It's a very active word. It means don't be passive. Be curious, be active, ask questions.
Yes.
Even if the questions might get you into trouble because you might think they don't sound smart enough, or maybe others, you fear that others might think they don't sound smart enough. So there's this active voice that I'm hearing in Be Brave.
Yes, and an active voice and lead with heart, or an active. There's a lot of things that I think are important in helping people. And one thing we try and do is we try and describe this is what being brave is, or this is what leading with heart is. Like lead with heart.
Yeah.
Lead with heart means
Kindness.
showing that you care. It means thinking about the person in front of you and being more empathetic. It is about caring. It's about doing, right? But it's not about being soft.
It doesn't mean you don't want results. You still want results.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean that I just tell you that everything you do is great. It means that I care and I lead with heart and I want you to be the best you can be. And sometimes I have to tell you things that make me uncomfortable telling you so that you can develop and grow. And you might not like them all the time, but that's not leading with heart is not just simply
Right. But it can still be done with empathy.
It can still be done with empathy, right? It's a very complex set of things, but when you do it well, it's incredibly powerful. It's not that straightforward and simple.
Yeah. And you were saying earlier, it's not just about clarity of what it is, but also clarity of what it is not.
Yes.
So people can very clearly understand that if I demonstrate a particular action, then I am either demonstrating my values, or not. And if I demonstrate a different type of action, then I am in the not bucket.
Yes.
So it's very clear as to what it is and what it is not, because I think that's important to understand if you want to focus.
It definitely is. And I think you and I were talking earlier, and one of the other things I think is important, like your values are look, it's easy to live your values when it's benefiting you. What's really hard, and you know you're living your values, is when it costs you something. And I think that is actually important. And it's why when you're having a debate about something, or you should be asking yourself, is this decision we're making consistent with our values?
Yeah, and I think I completely nailed it. I think values are they're simple, but they're hard when it costs.
They're hard when it costs you something. That's what we like to get people to focus on.
And you were sharing an example with me earlier.
Yeah, we had so in the business I'm in, you have a lot of partners who are out there, and they make their living by selling client work. And we generally allow people a great degree of latitude and autonomy, but we do sort of assess things and say like, oh, is that a project we want to do, et cetera. And a bunch of partners were very excited. A private equity company had bought another company in the healthcare space. And this company had convinced my partners that they were single-handedly going to rid the world of lung cancer, stop people from being addicted to cigarettes, and they were a massive healthcare positive influence. And I'm not going to name the company, but this group came to us and said, we want to do this work. And my initial reaction was like, you got to be kidding me, right? This company has marketed to teenagers. This company has done other things. What do you mean? And they're like, no, they're owned by private equity now. This is what they're going to do. I'm like, no private equity company is going to let them put a product out there that puts them out of business. They're going to addict people to a different substance that just isn't going to cause them to get lung cancer. But it's still not, is that really the kind of people we are? Right? And
are they lining up with your values?
No. And so we said, no, we're not going to do it. And so we both had to be brave and tell our partners that, but we also had to say, like, no, we're going to forego the revenue.
It's going to cost you.
It's going to cost us, right? Or there are times that clients say, I'd like you to do this. And you say to them, I realize that, but I don't want to take your money because I don't think it's going to deliver value. And part of it, you know what the truth is? What's best is when your values are so aligned that you can do what's right for someone else and it might cost you in the short run, but it benefits you in the long run. Because I've never met a client where I've told them I don't want your money for that, or I'd like to tell you I don't want to have you keep paying me for, because what you've asked me to do is not the problem you have. It's this thing over here. Let me stop the project. That's the kind of thing that builds that trust.
For both parties.
So to live your values consistently is incredibly powerful. It can cost you in the short run, but if you do it right, it almost always benefits you in the long run.
And that's the shared value for you and your client. So a lot of things you just talked about, the intrinsic value, showing up the way you believe your values to be, the way you want to show up, and consistently doing that. Doing it in a very clear way, making sure that everyone's very clear in your organization and focused. Because that's the other thing we were talking about earlier is brands, especially in institutions. We tend to sway where the world is going. One day it's this, one day it's that, because you're trying to appeal.
Well, and that gets you in trouble, right? You sort of, we talked earlier about Gen Z and how people want the company to stand for what they believe in. I want to work for a company that shares my values. And I'm like, this company has 60,000 employees. You all do not have one monolithic value. So sometimes when we're reactive, companies or people, like you're bobbing and weaving to try and meet whatever the loud voice is in the place, and it gets you in trouble because you can almost never win.
You can almost never win. And I think the mindset of having that spirit to want it to be a win-win at the end, even if it costs you in the short run, but as long as it works out in the long run, that's that shared value that you can provide to your client.
True to who you are as a person or the company, it inevitably benefits you in the long run.
And everyone else around you.
Mm-hmm.
That's what makes the world a better place. Thank you, Terry. Thank you for taking the time to come here on campus and sharing your thoughts. You've given us a lot to think about. And if I may summarize a few key points that I heard from you, and please feel free to add anything that you'd like. You talked about making the invisible visible and the power of allyship while accelerating change and accelerating breakthroughs. And how organizations right now are in the midst of revisiting assumptions and changing the way business should be and could be done moving forward. And lastly, about leading with your heart and having those core values that you really believe in show up in everything that you do in a consistent manner. So thank you for sharing those very powerful words, and we are really, really very fortunate to have you today on International Women's Day. So thanks again for being here.
Thank you for having me.